All right, here we are, week 9, American History Hybrid. Just pay attention this week. We're going to have two sections or two parts of notes. And we're looking at the 1920s, both the turbulent 1920s and also the contrast of the roaring 1920s. All right, by the end of part 1 of notes, you should be able to answer the following 9 learning objectives. 1. Summarize the reaction of the United States to the perceived threat of communism. 2. Analyze the cause and effect of the quota system. 3. Describe some of the post-war conflicts with labor, unions, and management. 4. Contrast Harding's policy of normalcy with the previous presidents of the Progressive Era reform. 5. Identify scandals that plagued Harding's presidency. 6. Summarize the impact of the automobile and other consumer goods on American life during the 1920s. 7. Explain how prosperity affected different groups of Americans. 8. Explain what ways the country's prosperity was superficial. Let's begin. All right, first we're going to take a look at the turbulent 1920s. All right, if you want a quick preview, complete the following chapter walk. Again, this will be chapter 22 in your text. This week, again, we're going to be looking at chapter 22 and 23 in the textbook. All right, demobilization. Again, women are asked to give up their jobs upon the return of the soldiers. 4.5 return. They demand an increase of industrial production and also the supply price. Defense industries productions drop simply because warfare has ended, and we also see a deep recession in Europe, which causes a deep recession in some places, super or hyperinflation, as we saw in Germany, which then creates a recession in the United States. All right, the state of the economy again. We see corporate enterprises emerge where they will consolidate or merge other small businesses. They'll increase marketing tactics and advertising, and capitalism will have an adverse effect for an agrarian society, where it'll have a more advantageous effect for the large corporate entities. We see an increase in standard of living, which we'll talk more about, and also ties into consumerism. And we also see the trickle-down economics, which really is the idea of capitalism. Again, when we increase the amount of corporate production, it will then trickle down to lower socioeconomic statuses of our economy, thus benefiting everyone. Rural America continues to struggle in the 1920s. Labor unrest begins. Really, labor unrest will escalate the Red Scare. Again, the first Red Scare, we'll take a look at 2 Red Scares during this trimester. Or I apologize, we'll take a look at one this trimester, then a second one in third trimester. But this first Red Scare really pinpoints 2 people. The first is going to be the immigrants, and then the second is going to be the anarchists. We'll see in 1919 nearly 4,000 strikes will incur. Public will not be sympathetic with the strikes because many of the workers, again, had the stigmatization of being immigrants or those taking jobs away from the returning soldiers. We'll see the Seattle shipyard, which 35,000 people will be affected by the U.S. Steel, which will be the largest, where 343,000 people were affected, and then the Boston Police Force, as well as looking at scabs or people that will replace the workers during this time. All right, we see a clash of values, new cultures and values. We'll see fundamentalism. Again, I want to go through this quickly because we'll talk about this a little bit later. Again, so we'll talk about some of these trials, specifically the lawyer of Darrow versus the State Representative Bryan. Again, if you want to take a look ahead at this, you can. The Red Scare, again, fear of radicals. They had a blurred meaning, not quite sure what radicals were. Oftentimes they're pinpointed by, at this time, J. Edgar Hoover, who was special assistant to the Attorney General during this time, claimed it as Red Scare, those being communist, socialists, or anarchists. We see the Palmer raids. Again, Palmer was appointed by J. Edgar Hoover as a special assistant. Palmer, Hoover, and other agents hunted down suspected radicals, people who opposed any form of government. What they would do is they simply would trample the people's civil rights by invading their private homes and offices and jailing suspects without legal counsel or without habeas corpus. Again, a law term used for just cause for their crime. Hundreds of foreigners that were born radicals were deported without trials. The Palmer raids failed to turn up evidence of revolutionary conspiracy or even explosives. Many thought that Palmer was just looking for a campaign issue to gain support for his presidential aspirations. The Palmer raids again affected every American across the entire United States. We also see the creation of the FBI during this time, the Federal Bureau of Investigation. We again hear about the Soviet Ark, again, the movement or migration of communists from Eastern European parts of the world to America. We see the highest Red Scare in the 1920s. Most people did not fall for the hysteria. The case of Sacco and Vanzetti. Niccolo Sacco and Bartolome Vanzetti were a shoemaker and a fish peddler, respectively. Both were Italian immigrants and anarchists, self-admitted anarchists. Both had evaded the draft during World War I. In 1920, Sacco and Vanzetti were arrested and charged with robbery and murder of a factory paymaster and his guard in southern Massachusetts. Witnesses had said the criminals appeared to be Italians. The accused asserted their innocence and provided alibis. The evidence against them was circumstantial, and the proceeding judge made no prejudging remarks regarding their Italian ancestry, and they were found guilty and sentenced to death in 1927. However, about 50 years later, in the 1970s, they were exonerated of these charges, not found guilty of the crimes, just being anarchists. And many Americans, really this case was brought in the limelight for Americans because it really it made many people feel as though the case of Sacco and Vanzetti were mistreated and begin to question our criminal justice system. Again, see how it relates to today. We see limiting immigration laws that are in place in the 1880s. We see a wave of migrants from southern and eastern European countries. Many of them will come across willing to work in jobs that offer low wages, such as coal mining, steel production, or textiles. Then in the 1920s, we bring about a quota system, which is a national mandate on limiting migrants to the United States. Between 1919 and 1921, the number of immigrants had grown almost 600%, from 141,000 people to 805,000 people. Congress, in response to the nativists, again during this time, those that were against immigrants, nativists pressured Congress to put a limit on immigrants from certain countries. Mostly those countries were Eastern and Southern European countries. So in 1921, a quota system is established, putting a maximum number of people to enter the United States. This really, again, only affected Southern and Eastern European countries, where about 2% of nationals living in the United States came from those countries. And really during this time, the quota law did not affect Western European countries. And later in 1927, the law put a specific mandate on the number of total migrants to that of 150. That should be another 150,000. And this law also prohibited Japanese immigration, which caused much ill will between the two countries. Japan, which had faithfully kept the gentleman's agreement to limit immigration to the United States, negotiated under Theodore Roosevelt in 1907. And the Japanese expressed anger over these immigration laws. There was labor unrest during this time. The American Federation of Labor pledged to avoid strikes. However, in 1919, saw more than 3 to 4,000, depending on the tax, strikes during some 4 million people walked off the jobs. Employers labeled striking workers as communists. The newspapers publicized them as communists, plots to establish a communist government here in the United States. The Boston police strike. The Boston police had not given a raise since the beginning of World War I. Among their many grievances was that they had been denied the right to unionize. With representatives asked for a raise and they were fired, the remaining policemen decided to strike. Massachusetts governor called on Calvin Coolidge, the president at this time, to help, and he called on the National Guard, and he stated there is no right to strike against the public safety by anyone, anywhere, anytime. The steel mill strike is another major strike during this time, which I talked about earlier. This is going to be the U.S. Steel strike, a strike against the U.S. Steel Corporation. They refused to meet the union mandates during this time. In response, 300,000 workers walked off their jobs. Steel companies hired steel breakers or scabs. Employees who argued to work during the strike and used force. Striking workers were beaten by police, federal troops, and state militias. Then the companies instituted a propaganda campaign linking the strikers to communism, thus creating the decline in labor movements during this time. However, there were some good outcomes of labor unrest. In 1923, the steel company, in the case of the steel mill strikes, agreed to an 8-hour workday, and that's if the steel workers agreed to not unionize. All right, so we see the Harding presidency. During this time, we already talked about Harding's call for normalcy, moving away from the Great War, and restoring America the way it was before the Great War. He's going to be pro-business. He's going to impose high tariffs on foreign trading nations, thus creating domestic production here in the United States, thus growing corporate development in the United States, and industrialization will soar under Harding's watch. One other thing about Harding also, during the repair of Europe after World War I, he did issue loans to both Britain and France to pay back $10 billion they had borrowed from the Americans during the war. And what he did is he raised taxes on some of the U.S. imports to as high as 60% that were exported to both Britain and France. This created resentment amongst both Britain and France, and they called the United States as being financially irresponsible. Scandals administration during this time, he set up his administration with many of his cronies, in other words, friends. They were called the Ohio Gang. Some referred to him as the president's poker playing cronies, who would soon cause a great deal of embarrassment for Harding. Some of the two of the particular scandals. The main problem with the Forbes scandal was didn't understand many of the issues that he had to deal with. So Harding's administration began to unravel as his corrupt friends used their offices to become wealth. Charles R. Forbes, the head of the Veterans Bureau, was caught illegally selling government and hospital supplies to private companies. The second scandal, the Teapot Dome scandal, the government had set aside oil-rich public lands at Teapot Dome, which is the area of Wyoming and Elk Hills, California, for use by the U.S. Navy. The Secretary of Interior during that time, Albert B. Fall, a close friend of various oil executives, managed to get the oil reserves transferred from the Navy to the Interior Department. Then Fall's secretary leased the land to two private oil companies, one Henry Sinclair's Mammoth Oil Company and the other to a lesser oil company. Nonetheless, Harding was found later to have been bribed, and he became the first American to be convicted of a felony while holding a cabinet position. I take that back. His Secretary of Interior was found guilty of a felony, but nonetheless, the public scrutiny pinpointed Harding. And it'll lead to a slow end of his presidency where he will not be reelected to his second term. But it will create Republican domination. We're going to bypass that video. But we can see after Woodrow Wilson, much of the American public, in terms of the electoral vote, the Electoral College, he was heavily favored in winning the election. American society demanded for a change in American government. They sought it with electing Harding in both the popularity poll as well as the electoral poll. And you can see here's the distribution of the popularity of Republicans. And again, popularity of Republicans will reign during the 1920s. Businesses of America. All right, again, Calvin Coolidge will replace Harding. He'll call again for high tariffs, which will be pro-business, same as his predecessor, Harding. That will reduce income taxes and will thus create more capital in industrial production, creating new technologies. New technologies will make work much more efficient, much faster. It will also essentially increase industrial production. That will create the ubiquitous of the automobile. The automobile will be mass manufactured, and as a result, there will be, besides the national road, which we learned about in first try, there will be Route 66 that's created that runs from Chicago to California. This route set up many subsidiary profitable stores and companies and like such as the gas stations, ExxonMobil, we see Sinclair, we see Standard Oil. They'll set up repair shops, they'll set up traffic signals. Again, the increased use of energy will be mandated with the growth of the vehicle. And we'll see the cities designed for shopping, so many people will migrate to the city, which is known as the urban sprawl. Not only is the city seen for shopping, but also for entertainment. A lot of Americans during this time, which we'll talk about later, will go to vaudevilles for movie entertainment. And this will also be the catalyst for airplanes. The young airplane industry will emerge during this time. There'll be mail carrying services mostly. They'll also do weather forecasting. By 1927, we'll see the first transatlantic passenger flights. And that, again, will happen with the adventure of Charles Lindbergh. American standard of living changes. Americans will own 40% of the world's wealth, and that wealth changed the way Americans lived. The average annual income rose more than 35% during this period, from about $522 on a yearly income to about $705 on a yearly income. People found it easy to spend all the extra income and then some. Some of the things that happened in the 1920s, electricity. We see the alternating electricity current made it possible to distribute electric power efficiently over long distances. Now electricity was no longer restricted to central cities, but could be transmitted to suburbs. The number of electrified houses grew, although most farms still lack power during this time. Consumerism will also grow during this time. Housewives will find a more luxurious or a more leisurely lifestyle. During the leisurely time, well, some of their activities of the traditional housewife will be minimized with the advent of electric appliances. We'll see now people will desire with their leisure time a better way of living in terms of looking youthful, looking more beautiful, looking more healthful, looking more wealthy. Again, superficialism again begins to emerge with consumerism. We'll also see the consumption of new goods such as cigarettes, candy, mouthwash, that most advertising will deem as necessities, when in reality we know they're not necessities. Again, that sets up the superficial prosperity. Although the national income did grow from about $64 billion in 1921 to $87 billion in 1929, but most of that wealth was concentrated with the wealthy or corporate entrepreneurs, which created the income gap. Income gap created a great disparity between workers and managers, again, between the poor class and the elite class. Specifically, the poor represented by the farmers during this time. With the new machinery, they were producing more food than ever, but they were drowning out the food prices. They produced more, but then the food prices, because of the high demand in the United States, food prices diminished or they lessened. We see installment plans, in other words, buying on credit, store credit. A dollar down is a dollar forever was the advertisement during this time. We see people putting installment plans, fourth installment plans, again, borrowing money that they didn't have to buy various goods to furnish your houses, with the new appliances and furniture, etc. During this time, they said, "You furnish the girl, we'll furnish your home." That's a quote that was used in advertisement by large corporations. All right, that will conclude part one. Again, review the learning outcomes of part one, and let's go ahead and dive right into part two. Part two is going to take a look at the following. We're going to take a look at the flip side of the 1920s. This will be known as the Roaring Twenties. At the end of these notes, you should be able to answer the following learning objectives. 1. Address the changing role of women in the 1920s. 2. Explain how urbanization created a new way of life and clashed with their traditional society. 3. Describe the controversy over the role of science and religion in American education and society. 4. Explain the image of the flapper and how it affected the attitudes of young women in the 1920s. 5. Describe popular culture of the 1920s. 6. Explain why the youth-dominated decade came to be known as the Roaring Twenties. 7. Identify the causes and results of the Great Migration of African Americans in northern cities. And lastly, describe the prolific African American artistic activities that became known as the Harlem Renaissance. Let's dive in. First, rural and urban differences during this time. We see the migration, again, what we refer to in the first set of notes as urbanization, and people moving to the cities. We see major cities growing in overall population numbers. The largest city during this time was New York City, that had over 5.6 million people. Next came cities like Philadelphia and Chicago that had 3 million people. Well, actually, I take that back. Chicago during this time had about 3 million people. Philadelphia had 2 million people. About another 67 cities claimed populations of over 100 million people. Chicago was known as the industrial power. It was home to native-born whites and African Americans. It had immigrant Poles, Irish, Russians, Italians, Swedes. It was an ethnic melting pot. Many of those workers, estimated 300,000, 150,000 worked on cars, 20,000 worked on trolleys. Some worked in movies, theaters. The vaudeville houses offered living for a variety of shows during this time. You can see a picture of a vaudeville right there. The city also changed the way people live. It was fast-paced. The fast pace led to, not necessarily leisurely. The city demanded endurance as as people continued to try to fill their pockets by working harder. And cities also created an experience that was impersonal and sometimes, in some accounts, frightening. And it also brought about what some fundamentals we'll see as sins, but it'll bring about gambling, drinking, and casual dating. Prohibition is incurred. We learned about this a while back when we talk about progressivism. Prohibition is going to be ratified in 1919. Prohibition is going to mandate that the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages be legally prohibited. Well, the result will be, we'll see about the prohibition. The U.S. government only hired about 1,500 poorly paid federal agents and local police to mandate this policy of prohibition across the entire United States. Virtually impossible for 1,500 people. Merges during this time would be speakeasies. Oftentimes they were called speakeasies because people spoke quietly or easily to avoid detection. Speakeasies could be found anywhere: in penthouses, cellars, office buildings, rooming houses, tenements, hardware stores, tea rooms. To be admitted to a speakeasy, one had to present a card or use a password. Alcohol was allowed in these speakeasies. Alcohol during this time was also allowed for medicinal and religious purposes. Prescriptions for alcohol and sale, sacrament of wine in the Catholic Church had skyrocketed. People also bought liquor from bootleggers during this time. They're basically smugglers of alcohol. They practiced carrying liquor in their legs of boots, who smuggled in from Canada, Cuba, or the West Indies, and thus called bootleggers. Organized crime emerges. One of the popular figures during this time in the major city of Chicago will be Al Capone, a gangster whose bootlegging empire grew over $600 million a year. Capone controlled most of the Chicago liquor business, by killing off his competition. During the 1920s, headlines reported that 522 bloody gang killings and made the image of a flashy Al Capone part of the folklore of the period. By the mid-1920s, only about 19% of Americans supported prohibition, and 1933 they repealed the 21st, or they create the 21st Amendment, which repeals prohibition. Did it work? I want you to decide. The science and religious clash, we see really fundamentalist religious gangs and the secular thinkers clashing during this time. Fundamentalists were skeptic of some of the scientific discoveries and theories of evolution. They rejected the theory of Charles Darwin, who in the 19th century stated the evolution theories of starting with plants and animal species that develop and changed over millions of years. The stronger ones grew to be the most fit ones. Fundamentalists rejected that. Fundamentalists express themselves in many ways in the South and the West. Again, fundamentalists will be strongest in the South, but we'll see some fundamentalists in the West as well. Preachers will lead religious revivals based on the authority of the Scriptures. One of the most powerful revivalists during this time was Billy Sunday, a baseball player turned preacher who staged emotional meetings across the South. Again, the fundamentalists gained supporters who began to call for laws prohibiting the teaching of evolution. Well, it comes to a head with Scopes' trial in 1925. This takes place in Tennessee, where Tennessee passes the first law that made teaching evolution illegal in education. However, a young biology teacher in Dayton, Tennessee, named John T. Scopes, accepted the challenge. He was teaching a biology class. He read the Civic Biology, and quoting, "We have now learned that animal forms may be arranged so as to begin with the simple one-cell forms and culminate with a group with which which includes man itself." And with teaching that in his class, he was promptly arrested. Well, then the ACLU, in other words, the American Civil Liberties Union, hired a popular lawyer named Clarence Darrow. He was one of the most famous trial lawyers during this time. The Scopes trial will go to court. They'll fight over whether or not evolution should be taught in American schools or in American public schools. And later, Scope was found guilty, and he was fined $100. The Tennessee Supreme Court later changed the verdict of changed it on a technicality. But the law outlining teaching of evolution remained in effect. But this was just the beginning, because now America as a whole had a clash over the teaching of evolution within education using a scientific perspective. Turning to young women in the 1920s, young women are going to experience a different way of life. We'll often see during this time they'll be called the wild women, or tomorrow will die. We see the emergence of the flapper. During the 1920s, a new ideal emerged for women flappers. It's the emaciated woman, the free woman who embraced new fashions, urban attitudes. They wore close-knitting felt hats, bright waistless dresses, an inch above the knees, skin tones, silk stockings, sleek pumps, and strings of beads replaced the dark and brim ankle-length dresses, whalebone corsets, and petticoats of the Victorian days. Young women clipped their hair back in boyish bobs and dyed it jet black. Some of the things that they did, they were defined the status quo of women during this time. They began smoking cigarettes, drinking in public, talking openly about sex. Oftentimes they did very promiscuous dances, such as the foxtrot, the camel walk, the tango, the charleston, the shimmy, and the abandon. As a result, a double standard emerges. Many publications, magazines, newspapers, and advertisements coined the flapper as being scandalous. When women courted women, they pursued women openly, women they intended to marry. But in the 1920s, casual dating became increasingly accepted, despite women really being scrutinized for casually dating, but men societally being accepted, creating this double standard. We see new opportunities emerge for women. Women during this time, we see female graduates turn to women professionals, where women will turn into teachers, nurses, and librarians. Some will even turn into clerical work, such as typists, clerks, secretaries, stenographs, and office making operators. But even in the 1930s, we see now a hierarchical change within an organization for women. Women take on managerial jobs. Thus, their pay is still less than that of men. We see the changing of family, birth rates decline. There's the we see the advent of birth control during this time, and families diminish in size. They go because, again, we are moving from an agrarian society to an urban society. You'll need less children simply because on farms you need more children as work hands or laborers. So we'll see the birth rate decline for several reasons. We'll see, again, corporations will create work-made clothes or corporate-made clothes. We'll see sliced bread. We'll see canned foods. Again, this will provide the technology for women to simplify their life and create more leisure. This also creates women having women with the ability to have more say in marriages. We see children at school. Again, children at school provides the women another avenue for using leisurely time to benefit the growth of a changing family. And also, with that being said, now families aren't really educating their children. It's more so their peers that educate children, because most children at this time now are receiving a compulsory public education. So they're at school for the duration of the day, usually from 7 a.m. to 3:30. So the socialization of the teens was by their peers. And when they're socialized by their peers, we see adolescent rebelliousness grows. And again, that will be supported by the growth of popular culture that is seen through entertainment during this time as well. Education and popular culture. About 4 million people now reside, by 1914, approximately 1 million American students attended high school. By 1926, about 4 million. The standards, educational standards, were based on the industrial jobs that were present during this time. We see also education's responsibility to integrate the various immigrants to have a common speaking language, that being English. So educators were also expected not only to teach them standards of the industrial jobs, but also to teach a common language, that being English. Mass media in the form of newspaper and radios tries to shape a mass culture. Some of the big magazines during this time, Reader's Digest, and also Time. Time comes in 1923, Reader's Digest in 1922. Radio is also going to be known as the golden age of radio. Most of the radio audience is going to be tuning into the airwaves. By 1930, 40% of U.S. households had radios. In the 1920s, radio was a formal affair. Announcers and musicians dressed in their finest attire, even without a live audience. And one other thing about news is radio, it gave people news as it happened. So it was a time compression, no time compression between the event and heard by the masses. We see new heroes emerge during this time. In 1929, Americans spent about $4.5 billion on entertainment. Much of that entertainment, we see the advent of crossword puzzles, Mahjong, a Chinese game played with similar to dominoes. We see flagpole sitting, dance marathons. We see athletic stadiums to see their sports superstars. The most popular sport during this time being baseball. Babe Ruth was a New York Yankee slugger in the 1920s. He had a league lead 60 home runs in 1927. We see tennis. We see the Negro National League baseball team emerge in the 1920s. We see Charles Lindbergh, again, the first to sail a nonstop transatlantic flight in 1927 on the plane right here, the Spirit of St. Louis. Again, Charles Lindbergh, our very own here in Minnesota. Birthplace, Little Falls. We see movies now seen as a national pastime. Movies were based on romance and comedy. We see movies such as The Jazz Singer, Disney's Steamboat Willie, The first animated film was released in 1928. George Gershwin, he's going to be a Jewish composer. He merged popular concert music with American jazz, creating a new sound that identified as being American sound. F. Scott Fitzgerald, again, one of our own here, born in St. Paul. Many of you will read his book, The Great Gatsby. He'll also write another book called Side of Paradise. He's going to describe the 1920s as a period of gaiety and freedom, portraying wealthy and attractive people leading imperiled lives in gilded surroundings. Again, we look at the inner struggle within society of consumerism and living a conservative life. Ernest Hemingway is going to be a well-known author during this time. He's going to be an expatriate. He's going to write novels such as The Sun Also Rises, A Farewell to Arms. He's going to introduce a tough, simplified style of writing that set a new literature standard. The Time report indicated that his standard was round stones polished by rain and wind. The Harlem Renaissance in the 1920s. For the first time, we see now wide notoriety given to African Americans, really portrayed by themselves as now recognizing the beauty of being black, and the phrase "black is beautiful" will emerge. Don't forget the Great Migration that takes place between 1910 and 1920 is going to send about several African Americans to northern and western cities. African Americans in northern cities will make up about 40% of the population. African Americans will, in 1909, the National Association for Advancement of Colored People is established. This is going to be a protest group but they protest racial violence. They use, again, non-aggressive means or non-violent means. NAACP produces a magazine as a platform for their struggle for civil rights. On the other hand, Marcus Garvey is going to be an immigrant from Jamaica. He believed that African Americans should build a separate society. He's going to find the Universal Negro Improvement Association, which is going to be known as the UNI. Again, he's going to call for the return to Africa. But his support begins to wane later in the 1920s, about the mid-1920s, after he's convicted of mail fraud and jailed. Harlem in New York City. Again, New York City, as we talked about earlier, about 5.6 million people are living in New York City, and about 40% of African Americans will reside in part of New York City, that being in the area of Harlem. Harlem Renaissance is going to be known as a literary and artistic movement celebrating African American culture. Langston Hughes is going to be a notable poet. He's going to describe the difficult lives of working class African Americans. Some of his poems moved a tempo of jazz and blues. We're going to see Louis Armstrong. He's going to be a trumpet player in the 1920s. He will establish a Creole jazz band. His talents rocketed him to stardom in the jazz world. Armstrong made a huge impression in Chicago in 1924. Armstrong performed in cotton clubs, as well as Duke Ellington. With the spread of jazz, jazz spread quickly to such cities as Kansas City, Memphis, and New York City. It became the most popular music for dancing. During the 1920s, Harlem pulsed the sound of jazz, which lured throngs of whites to the showy, exotic nightclubs there, including the famed Cotton Club. Again, the Cotton Club was a common place where Duke Ellington performed. Duke Ellington was a jazz pianist and composer. He led a 10-piece orchestra in the Cotton Club. Bessie Smith, during this time, female blues singer. By 1927, she's going to be known as the highest paid black artist in the world. All right, at the conclusion of Week 9 notes, please again go back to both parts to review the learning objectives and make sure you clearly understand the answers, and then begin Week 9's activity.